For decades, the story ran in one direction. Europe taught the world how to eat, the slow lunch, the fixed menu passed down through generations, the belief that food deserved patience. America, in that story, was the exception, a country that ate fast because it hadn't learned better. It was a comfortable narrative, and for a long time, no one on either side of the Atlantic felt the need to question it. Then something quieter happened. Travelers who arrived in the United States expecting to tolerate the food, not enjoy it, started noticing things they couldn't quite file away. A menu that changed shape depending on the country they were in, a line that moved faster than any restaurant they'd known, a price that didn't shift by the time the bill came. What began as a detour from real meals started to look, uncomfortably, like a system someone had actually thought through. What they were tasting wasn't just a burger. It was the end result of choices most people never see. In factories, in loan offices, in zoning boards, decades before anyone took a bite. And once a person understands what's actually built into that first fry, it becomes difficult to go back to believing convenience was ever the opposite of design. Ask most people what America gave the world of food, and the answer comes fast, almost dismissively. The hamburger. Ground beef between two pieces of bread. Nothing about it sounds like an invention. Germany had ground meat centuries earlier. England had the sandwich long before that. So if the burger itself wasn't new, what did America actually build? Not a dish, a method, and it came from an unlikely place. In 1948, two brothers running a modest drive-in in San Bernardino, California, made a decision that looked at the time close to professional suicide. Richard and Maurice McDonald fired their entire staff of car hops, the waitresses who took orders through car windows, and tore their kitchen apart from the ground up. They cut the menu down to 9 items. Then they split the cooking into fixed roles. One person only grilled, one person only dressed buns, one person only bagged orders. Each motion timed and repeated in the exact same sequence, order after order, with no variation allowed. They called it the Speedy Service System, and the idea behind it hadn't come from anywhere near a restaurant. It came from Detroit, where Henry Ford had already shown, decades earlier, that breaking a complicated task into small, repeatable motions could produce something at a volume no single craftsman could ever match. The brothers weren't chasing a better burger. They were chasing a better kitchen, one where the food tasted the same on a Tuesday in June as it had on a Friday in January, regardless of who was standing at the grill that day. That single shift from a meal shaped by a cook's memory to a meal shaped by a fixed procedure is the difference between a recipe and a blueprint. A recipe lives in one place, guarded by one hand. A blueprint can be handed to a stranger 1,000 miles away and produce the same result on the first try. Europe, at that same moment, was operating almost entirely on the recipe model, and for excellent reasons. France had the brasserie, built around a chef's personal touch. Germany had the imbus, shaped by regional habit. Italy had the trattoria, where a dish tasted different 2 streets over on purpose. These places drew their entire value from not being identical to the one down the road, a value the McDonald brothers system quietly gave up in exchange for something else, the ability to travel. That trade is easy to overlook, but it explains almost everything that followed. A tradition built on a chef's individuality can produce extraordinary food, yet it resists being copied exactly because copying it exactly would defeat the point. A system built on sameness carries no such resistance. It doesn't need a master chef to open in a new city. It needs a manual, a timer, and someone willing to follow both. Once food could be manufactured with that kind of precision, speed stopped being a compromise diners tolerated and became something they specifically sought out. No European country lacked the talent to build a version of this. What it lacked was the motive. Centuries of culinary institutions, later formalized by things like the Michelin star, were built to reward a meal for being singular, not for being identical to 10,000 others. Two brothers in California, without any interest in prestige, were solving an entirely different equation. Not how good a meal could taste, but how reliably it could be rebuilt anywhere, by anyone, at any hour. It would turn out to be the equation the rest of the world eventually adopted, whether it wanted to admit borrowing it or not. Somewhere in every fast food kitchen operating today, in Paris, in Tokyo, in a gas station off a highway in Nairobi, that same 1948 logic is still quietly running the room, long after the two brothers who designed it were bought out and forgotten by most of the customers eating under their invention. A system that precise, though, still needed someone with the nerve to build it far past the reach of its inventors, and someone else's fingerprints belong on that part of the story entirely. The McDonald brothers had built something remarkable, but by the mid-1950s, their ambition had stalled at the edge of what two men could personally oversee. One flagship restaurant in San Bernardino, a handful of others they'd trained by hand. Expanding further meant more capital, more sites, more trust in strangers than they were willing to risk. The system was flawless. The reach was not. It took an outsider to see what the brothers had missed. A traveling salesman of milkshake machines named Ray Kroc, a man who had spent his career equipping other people's restaurants rather than running his own. He understood, before they did, that the real product wasn't the hamburger. It was the right to become someone who sold it. Franchising already existed in scattered American forms. Car dealerships, a few hotel chains. What Kroc engineered was sharper, a financial pipeline where an ordinary person with no restaurant background and no inherited wealth could walk into a bank, secure a modest loan, and walk out owning a working piece of a national brand. No family name required, no decades of apprenticeship under a master chef, just capital, discipline, and a willingness to follow the manual exactly as written. This is where the story quietly stops being about food and starts being about who, in a given society, gets permission to own things. In much of Europe at the time, ownership of a significant food business ran through older, narrower channels. A recipe passed down through a single family, a guild membership earned over years under centuries-old rules, capital that tended to travel along existing lines of class rather than land on whoever walked in with a plan. None of that made European food culture lesser. It's part of what kept a bistro in Lyon from ever being mistaken for one in Marseille. But it also meant the door into ownership stayed narrow, guarded by inheritance more than ability. A gifted cook could, in time, become a respected chef. Becoming the owner of something running across 40 countries was a different order of ambition. One the surrounding system was never built to hand out freely. Kroc's model quietly rewired that. By the early 1960s, the person signing a franchise agreement was as likely to be a former police officer as a retired serviceman. A school teacher looking for a second income as a factory worker who'd spent a decade saving. The qualification wasn't bloodline, it was a loan application and a willingness to show up at 5 every morning. Kroc structured the arrangement so headquarters profited largely by controlling the real estate under each restaurant and leasing it back to the owner, which meant the company had every incentive to help each new franchisee succeed rather than collect a fee and walk away. It functioned as a machine for converting ordinary savings into ownership stakes in something larger than any one person could build alone, at a speed no European nation was structurally positioned to match, because none had built the banking, real estate, and regulatory scaffolding to move that fast. The compounding was less like expansion and more like a chain reaction. While other nations exported their culinary traditions the old way, a single flagship restaurant opening abroad, carried by an embassy's prestige or a chef's personal reputation, American franchises were opening at a rate of hundreds a year, each one independently financed, independently invested in succeeding because someone's mortgage now depended on it. There's a real difference between a brand growing because a corporation decided to open another branch, and a brand growing because thousands of separate families each bet their own savings on it. The second kind of growth is harder to stop. It isn't centrally controlled. It's distributed, personal, and stubborn. It leaves behind a quieter question than any about taste. If a country can be measured not only by what it invents, but by how widely it hands out the chance to own what gets built from it, then the real export sitting inside every franchise sign wasn't a hamburger recipe at all. It was a door left open wider than almost anywhere else for anyone willing to walk through it. Picture the same order placed in two different countries. In one, a customer waits at a counter, watches the food prepared by hand, pays, and carries the tray to a table. In the other, a customer never leaves the driver's seat, pulls up, orders through a speaker, pays at one window, collects food at the next, and is back on the road inside 3 minutes. Engine never off. Most people file this away as convenience. It's actually the leftover shape of a decision made decades earlier by people who were never thinking about lunch at all. After the Second World War, American cities faced a problem much of Europe simply didn't share at the same scale. Room to expand outward, and millions of returning soldiers holding government-backed loans, ready to buy homes in that new space. Local governments wrote zoning laws around a single assumption: that residents would arrive by car, wide roads, deep setbacks from the street, commercial lots built with enough depth that a vehicle could loop past a building without its driver ever stepping out. When In-N-Out, and later McDonald's, popularized the drive-thru window through the 1950s, they weren't inventing something new so much as filling a slot that the surrounding infrastructure had already carved out for them. European cities were working from a different set of constraints, and not by choice. Most had been laid out centuries before the automobile existed. Narrow medieval streets in some, dense post-war rebuilding in others, but almost never with the open land a drive-thru lot required. Adding one to a street in central Rome or Amsterdam wasn't a matter of taste. In most cases, it was simply impossible without tearing down what already stood there. The two continents weren't choosing different speeds of eating. They were building lunch on top of two entirely different centuries of infrastructure. What looks, from a distance, like a difference in temperament, Americans in a rush, Europeans content to linger, is really a difference in what the pavement itself allows. A driver in Phoenix or Atlanta can move through an entire meal without breaking a single continuous motion. Driving, ordering, paying, eating, driving again. No zoning board in 1955 sat down intending to shape a national mood. They were approving lot dimensions. But the mood got built anyway, one commercial permit at a time, long before anyone noticed what it added up to. There's a value sitting underneath all of this that has very little to do with food: the right to keep moving without needing anyone's permission to stop. It's the same instinct behind the interstate highway system, behind the suburbs spreading in every direction, behind a country that has always measured distance in hours rather than kilometers, on the assumption that the hours belong to the traveler to spend however they choose. The drive-thru window didn't create that instinct. It simply founded a place to eat. European visitors who use one for the first time often land on the same word, almost involuntarily: strange. Not because the food is unusual, but because of the sensation underneath it. The mild disorientation of never having to stop moving at all, for anything, including lunch. Few places on Earth are built to make that feel normal. What stays with a traveler longer than the meal itself is the road it was eaten on, because the same instinct that refused to let anyone stop moving would, before long, have to answer for something harder. What happens when the product built for that road gets served on a completely different street, in a country that never built the road at all? There's a small telling detail that most people notice only once someone points it out. A McDonald's in Paris sells a McBaguette. One in Tokyo sells a teriyaki McBurger. One in Manila sells McSpaghetti, sweet and orange red, next to fried chicken on the same tray. It's easy to see this as a company simply chasing local taste. A marketing footnote, nothing more. Looked at closely, it's something closer to a strategy most brands in any country never manage to pull off at all. The instinct behind it traces back to how the company was built from the start. Because ownership had already been handed out through franchising, local operators who knew their own market, their own customers, their own habits. Headquarters in Illinois was never positioned to dictate the menu from a distance the way a tightly centralized company might have. It had to trust the person running the location in Paris to know what Paris actually wanted, and it built systems that allowed that person to adjust the product without breaking the brand. What looks from the outside like generosity toward local taste is really the franchise structure doing exactly what it was designed to do decades earlier, letting individual operators solve individual problems at scale without waiting for permission from a headquarters that had never visited their city. Compare that to how European culinary traditions have typically moved outward. A French bistro opening in New York usually succeeds by staying recognizably French. The appeal is authenticity, not adaptation. An Italian trattoria abroad sells itself on being the real thing, unaltered, a taste of somewhere else exactly as it exists at home. There is nothing wrong with that approach. It has produced some of the most respected restaurants on earth. But it is also, by its nature, a strategy that resists change. The entire value proposition collapses the moment the dish stops tasting like where it came from. European food brands, built on the promise of origin, largely stayed loyal to that promise wherever they went, which meant they rarely scaled the way an infinitely adjustable American system could. America's fast food chains took the opposite bet, and it paid off in a way few predicted. Keep the operational skeleton identical everywhere. The timing, the layout, the training, the pricing structure, but let the actual food flex to fit wherever it landed. It is, in effect, the corporate equivalent of a language that keeps its grammar intact while borrowing new vocabulary in every country it enters. The result isn't a diluted brand. It's a brand fluent enough to sound local everywhere, while still being unmistakably itself underneath. What makes this worth noticing isn't really the McBaguette. It's what the McBaguette proves, that a system built in California in the 1950s turned out to be flexible enough to survive contact with dozens of unrelated food cultures without losing its identity in any of them. Most ideas, when they travel that far, either refuse to change and stay a curiosity, or change so much they stop being themselves. American fast food found a third option, bending exactly as much as each new market required, and not 1 degree further. It's a kind of influence that doesn't look like influence at all, because it never asks anyone to convert. Paris didn't start eating like America. America simply found a way to sit down at Paris's table without needing an invitation, and somehow left wearing whatever the local color happened to be, while the frame underneath never moved an inch. Fact 5. The price you can trust. Ask a European who has spent real time eating in the United States what surprised them least about the food and most about the experience, and the answer rarely involves flavor at all. It's usually something smaller, almost embarrassing to admit matters this much. They knew, before a single bite arrived, exactly what they would pay. That certainty is not the default experience of eating out across much of Europe, and the reasons run deeper than habit or mood. In many countries, a restaurant meal arrives with a sequence of small decisions that compound quietly on the final bill. A cover charge just for occupying the table, bread and water that isn't actually free, a service charge added automatically that may or may not overlap with whatever cash is left behind as a tip. None of this is dishonest. It's simply how the economics of European hospitality evolved over a much longer stretch of time, built around the idea that a meal is an extended experience worth paying for in layers, each one representing something the restaurant provided beyond the food itself. But it also means the number at the bottom of the check is rarely the number a customer walked in expecting, and a portion of every meal is spent doing quiet arithmetic instead of simply eating. American fast food solved a problem most people didn't realize they were carrying until the alternative was placed directly in front of them. The price on the board is the price at the register. No cover charge, no service fee folded in without explanation. No ambiguity about whether a tip is expected, because in this specific transaction, there typically isn't one to calculate at all. It sounds like a small mechanical fact about menus and cash registers, and yet it changes the entire emotional texture of a meal. A customer isn't managing a negotiation with unfamiliar rules. They're making exactly one decision, what to order, and then the transaction is simply over. This kind of pricing didn't begin in a restaurant. It traces back to a much older shift in how Americans learned to shop in the first place. In the late 1800s, large retailers like Wanamaker's and later Sears began fixing prices on tags rather than leaving them open to haggling between clerk and customer. A radical departure at the time when negotiating a price was still the norm across most of the world, including much of Europe. The idea was simple but had enormous consequences. If the price is the same for everyone, trust no longer depends on how good a customer is at bargaining or how honest a particular seller happens to feel that day. It becomes structural instead of personal. That single idea, born in department stores decades before the first fast food counter existed, eventually filtered into how an entire country would come to expect commerce to work, including, generations later, the exact price of a hamburger meal. There's a reason this specific kind of clarity lands so hard with European visitors, and it isn't about being cheap or rushed or unsophisticated about food. It's about a value sitting quietly underneath American commerce more broadly. The belief that a fair deal is one where both sides know the terms before they agree to anything, rather than discovering them afterward. It's the instinct behind sticker prices in a country where haggling never became the norm, the way it did in markets across Southern Europe or the Middle East. It's the instinct behind a menu board that lists a final total rather than a base price with assumed extras stacked on top, invisible until the check arrives. Fast food didn't invent that value. It simply became one of the clearest possible places to feel it, because the entire transaction compresses into under 2 minutes, with almost nothing left open to interpretation. What's easy to miss is that this isn't really a story about frugality or about a country eating fast because it doesn't care about food. It's a story about a nation that built an entire retail culture: department stores, diners, drive-thrus, vending machines, self-checkout lanes, around the idea that trust between strangers works best when it's written down in advance, not negotiated in the moment, not left to the discretion of whoever happens to be behind the counter. A European tourist ordering a combo meal in Ohio isn't only buying lunch. They're briefly stepping into a version of commerce where the seller decided, long before that customer ever walked in, not to test how much surprise the buyer would be willing to absorb. It's a small thing to notice, and an easy one to forget by the time the tray is cleared. But it's also, in its own quiet way, a kind of promise. The idea that a stranger behind a counter, in a country of 330 million people, will charge the same person the same price on a Tuesday as on a Saturday, without exception, without negotiation, and without ever needing to be watched to make sure of it. None of this started with a hamburger. It started with a decision to break a kitchen into repeatable motion, a decision to let anyone with a loan and a work ethic own a piece of something larger than themselves, a decision to build roads wide enough that no one would ever have to fully stop. Each choice made separately by different people in different decades for reasons that had nothing to do with each other, and yet somehow they all pointed the same direction, toward speed that didn't feel rushed, toward ownership that didn't require permission, toward a price that never needed to be questioned. What a European traveler tastes in that first bite isn't really flavor. It's the accumulated weight of 100 small structural decisions, most of them made by people who never once thought they were building a symbol of anything. The zoning board wasn't thinking about identity. The loan officer wasn't thinking about the American dream. They were solving small, practical problems: where to put a driveway, how to underwrite a franchise fee, and somewhere in the accumulation of all those practical answers, a system emerged that the rest of the world would spend the next 70 years trying to understand, copy, or resist. Maybe that's the real reason the story keeps traveling the way it does. Not because the food itself is extraordinary, but because it's nearly impossible to separate what's on the tray from everything that had to be true about a country before that tray could exist. A place confident enough to let strangers reinvent its national dish in their own image. A place that decided, generations ago, that a fair price mattered more than a personal negotiation. A place built, quite literally, so that